Hi everyone, welcome to the session, Enjoy Pitching Perfectly, 15 Mantras from 15 Years of Data Viz. My name's Eugene, and we'll jump straight into the presentation goals. Whether you are new to presentations or pitching, or you don't feel comfortable, or you've done it for a while and just want to improve, or you want to get really good at it, the promise of this session is to be able to help you with engaging the audiences and the stakeholders that you need to pitch or present to, and convince them of the actions that you want them to take based off of the insights that you have. This session is sponsored by Yukon Economic Development as part of a series of 4 sessions called the DDE+I sessions, which are the Data-Driven Entrepreneurship Innovation sessions. And this particular one was part of a half-a-day program where attendees would come in with ideas, projects from government, or startup ideas, listen to a pitch or this session that you're going through right now, and then be able to pitch your own ideas, projects, startups, and provide feedback as well for one another. It's meant to be a bit of a safe space for people to be able to get good feedback, and also the attendees, the pitchers, will also be those same ones that are judging, so that they get an idea of what it feels like to be judging on the other side of the table. This is me, and I'm the chair of the Canadian Open Data Society. I've presented at and taught workshops at academic and visualization conferences internationally on open data and visualization. I didn't quite start out this way though, in terms of pitching. I first started out with glossophobia, and if you don't know what that means, that's fine. It's the fear of public speaking. When I first started publicly speaking, I remember just shivering and just physically shaking, even though I'm just reading from a piece of paper I had just written on. I still remember there were times where I would have panic attacks in a small room with just a small group of people just talking. And of course, from there, I decided to go into electrical engineering because, hey, I didn't have to be good at that public speaking thing. The irony, of course, is that the peers and my teammates hated it more than I did. So in order to get good marks, I ended up having to try really hard to get better at it. And then, of course, of all things, I did some work in tech, and then with a startup, and then finally, over the past 10-15 years, doing data visualization, revealing and communicating insights to ever larger audiences. So in the past 15 years since my undergrad, I've created all sorts of data visualizations, including this animation that you see right here. You'll see a bunch of maps, as well as Sankey on the right. And I would get interviewed on a few of these visualizations. Some of the work that I would have put together, I'd find on New York Times or NPR, and then also work on visualizations that are created specifically to convince executives at Fortune 100 companies to make multi-million-dollar decisions with. So from my humble beginnings of panic attacks, I've made all sorts of different presentations ranging from open data to AI. I've been paid to run workshops from Canada to France, and today I feel pretty comfortable, confident, effective, and probably most importantly to me, I just enjoy it. I enjoy presenting and pitching. And I want to take all those lessons that I've learned and distill them to the most critical and useful lessons for you. So, going back to the presentation goals, the idea is that regardless of what experience you have, the session is to try and help you engage your audiences more effectively, as well as convincing them to take the actions that you want them to take. To do that, we'll go through 15 insights or mantras that I've learned from the past 15 years, and we'll provide 5 of them at each stage. Now, the advice that might come from the start stage or earlier stages might still be really useful and helpful to you if you're in the later stages. I just categorize them in that way because I think they're mostly relevant for that particular stage. On the bottom right, you'll notice that there are icons indicating the stage at which the mantra is being introduced or talked about. Just useful for us a little bit as a bookmark to know where we are so far in the session as well. The first tip or insight or mantra is this myth that there is this perfect style or personality. With this quote here, fill in the blanks. In my case, you could say introverts are just bad at presenting. And the reality is it's not true. You could probably find examples of people with your personality that have done an amazing job at presenting. So you could ask, where would you find this example? And you'd find them probably at TED Talks. Then you might also follow up and say to me, hey, you know what? All the people on TED Talks, they're amazing speakers. They all sound the same. What are you talking about? And then I'll say to you, please take a look at some of the work that some researchers have done at an IEEE Viz, which is a visualization conference. Researchers looked and studied across multiple TED Talks and found different styles of presenting, ranging from open storytelling styles to ones that are a little bit more conservative, quote unquote, the scientist style. I guess the takeaway here is that there isn't a singular style that you have to be following to be good at it. Just be aware of what you're working with, what you're strong at, and what you might need help with. In my case, I know that I can be very comfortable talking about things I have experience with, but I also tend to rush things as much as possible and try and squeeze as much as I can. So I need to be aware personally of how much I speak and how much information I try and get across. And that brings me to the next tip, which is a really useful one and one of the most useful ones when people are first starting out, which is to try and keep your pitches and presentations simple with just 1 point per slide. That way you don't have to memorize a whole bunch of things when you're going through the slide, and whenever you see the slide, it becomes a bit of a trigger point for you to start talking about that 1 point. It's really clear, it's concise, and it's really easy to do. Another thing that I've seen many people get caught up with, especially early on when they try and show data and charts, is they try and jazz it up and add more, I guess, more visual features to them. And it's often really the opposite of what you want to do. So you can find a full series of these examples on Dark Horse Analytics, or you can go to dha.io to find that, where they cover examples like this with charts, graphs, maps. But as an example here, your bar chart could look like this, or could look like this. And it's such a substantially different look and feel, and it's so much more effective. And even better, if I put them side by side, you'll be able to see what I mean. And this isn't just a small or simple example. If you look at publications like The Economist, you'll notice that their charts tend to be a lot simpler, a lot more minimalist, because they're elegant and clear for people to understand. So again, it's a common mistake to add a lot of flair, especially early on. So whenever you can, try to simple as much as possible. Next point here is that the audience ultimately wants you to be successful. They want to have a good time. And if you're nervous because you're thinking, oh man, they're going to be judging me when I get up there and I really don't want to screw this up, that added pressure is probably going to make things worse for you. Instead, try and imagine yourself as being part of the audience, or just imagine yourself in when you are part of the audience. When you see someone speaking, you don't want to be bored. You want to kind of listen and be interested in what sort of insights they have to impart. And even if the person up there is struggling and not being able to do a good job of their presentation, but you see that they're trying, you're going to hope that they do well, and you're going to give them more leeway to do so. So I guess the long and short of it is give yourself less pressure, know that everyone wants you to succeed, And even if you don't, as long as you try, people will still love you for trying. Final point of this beginner or this start stage is it's bigger than you, and essentially it's not about you or me. I'll give you a personal example. Uh, in my undergrad, there was this one time where undergrad students would get together, 500 of them in this auditorium. And I was part of this first year engineering club where we had this newsletter put out at the beginning, at the front of the class, and someone had ineffectively announced that you should go and pick it up. And of course, nobody did, which was somewhat stressful to me because I knew that in that newsletter, there was information that was really useful. In particular, there was a set of really experienced and well-known math profs that had helped to run these really effective exam sessions. So the attendees generally who attended them would do fairly well or better than other people. And so this is sort of information I think the other undergrad students in engineering would really want. And so realizing they weren't picking it up, I remember still shaking, walking up to the front of that auditorium and just saying to them, "Hey, this is really important. Here's what is in these newsletters." And then right after that, people start to go and pick it up. And I bring this example up just because, again, it's just to reinforce the idea that it's not about you or me. It's about the audience and the knowledge that you want to connect them with. And so you could be someone who is silent, someone who is maybe not very effective, or someone who is really effective. And I know personally, I started out really bad at first in terms of being able to deliver messages well, but the passion for getting people knowledge that would be beneficial to them was a main driver for me, and it forced me out of my comfort zone. So point here is that you could use that passion to drive yourself past the fears or concerns around public speaking. Hope that was useful. Take a bit of a breather if you'd like here. Then we'll move on to the intermediate mantras. The 6th point here is pretty straightforward. I think it's almost obvious to a lot of people, but the sort of pitch that you want to give to a nonprofit is going to be very different than the one that you would give to a director at an organization, which is also going to be very different from the one for a VC or an investor. And even more critically, within each one of these segments, not all nonprofits are the same for organizations or VCs. And so the more you research and are able to communicate what you've learned about the organization you're pitching to, the more they'll be interested in what you have to say because clearly you've done the homework and you care about what they care about. And so it's just a piece of advice to just understand them better. And by communicating that, you'll also get to gain their trust a little bit better as well. Not to mention, of course, the actual pitch itself will be better because you've tailored it better to their needs. With pitches and presentations, start as quickly as you can, as soon as you can, with the goals. I have seen pitches and presentations where it could be generally presentations half an hour in and the goals haven't been talked about into an hour-long presentation, and people would be lost by that point. One of the slides I hate, or situations I hate, is just bullet hell, and you'll see why I hate it. Because it's very common for presentations to have multiple points. People start reading them and tuning out the speaker. They are often used by this presenter as a slide to read. If so, reading is faster than speaking, so the audience gets bored waiting. I'm sure you've seen more dense bullet point slides than this one. Note that here there are 8 bullet points, but they are somewhat related. And so one way to fix that is to replace bullet points with slides. And more specifically, there are some assets that you can find like Unsplash or the Noun Project, both of which I've used to create this presentation and for you. And this also somewhat relates to the 1 point per slide point that was in the earlier stage. Now, you might notice that there's a bit of an elephant here, and it's a bit of a trigger point here for something that you may or may not have noticed. But a few slides back, this point right here, it's very important to do the cub. I didn't mention it, I didn't actually go into detail about it, and it's to highlight this point that if you did notice it and were confused, it's what I call an elephant in the room that you want to kill quickly. And it's just questions or things that someone looking at your presentation might notice, but will need to wait for you to finish your entire presentation to be able to ask you the question. And it's not what you want to have happen, because people will hold on to those points and try and balance it to with what you're saying, either forgetting the point or forgetting what you're going to say. So kill them as quickly as possible. And you can do that easily by just asking people to review your presentation. Sometimes you do have a lot of information to give and a lot of information you want people to understand. And it seems impossible. Like, you think, oh, there's like 20 points or 15 points, whatever it is. How do you go do that? And in my case, you could just structure and categorize like I did with the different stages, so that it becomes a little bit more accessible for people to understand and to keep in mind. So we'll come up to our final insights. Take another moment here if you want to take a pause to take a bit of breather to review or think about what we just went through. That'd be great. I also invite you to think of any questions that you might have, because, well, in this video I can't obviously answer them. Happy to answer any questions you might have over my email or LinkedIn. I'll give that information towards the end of the presentation. The 11th mantra is the reverse 80-20 rule. Now, I'm assuming you probably know what the 80-20 rule is. If not, it just says that 80% of the value that you get out of things that you create come from the first 20% of your effort. It's just a general rule that isn't always true, but it often does end up being true. The reverse rule is actually the same rule, just looked at a little bit differently. Now, most people are going to do things to create a presentation or some sort of report to a level of, let's say, an 80% score, an 82% score. But in a world of 80% outputs, a 90% one will stand out a lot, and a 95% one will stand out even more. Even if it did end up taking you a lot more time and effort, let's say 70% extra on top of the 20% to get there. Now, it's not to say that you have to do it for everything, because you can't, right? Like, there's no way you could spend 20 hours on every single presentation, and normal is perfectly fine. But if you want to be good or even great, I'm suggesting you want to put in the extra effort, because if you want to stand out, and it's often worth it to stand out, you'll need to put in the extra effort. Once you create things with this sort of mindset, the output are things that you'll be able to be proud to be able to show off to other people. You can add them to your resume, your portfolio, and you know that it's been done so well that it'll be well received. Around the notion of extra effort, you want to record yourself, and you want to practice and practice even more of others, and then just practice even more. Steve Jobs was notorious for the amount of effort he put into preparing for his presentations or his pitches. It's just important to note that it's not something that's automatically magical. People are bound with talent. Often it's all about the practice and trying things out and iterating on it. It's also true that you probably have a limited amount of people to practice with, which is why I have this rule or this mantra idea of the ABC buckets for feedback. It actually originated from when I was looking for internships as an undergrad. I'm essentially classifying my opportunities into ABC buckets, which you could classify as the best, okay, and if I have to, choices, right? And so whenever I sent out resumes, I wouldn't send them out to bucket A opportunities first. I'd always send them to bucket B ones, know that I would make mistakes, and be perfectly fine with that as an outcome. And then after that, I'd send them to bucket A opportunities. Now, with presentations and feedback, you will only get so many first impressions, so you can start first with colleagues or people who could provide you some initial feedback. They'll be really great at trying to identify the elephants that you have in your presentations. Now, once they've helped with that and helped to make your presentation clearer, then you can look for people who are closer towards your target audience so that they'll give you better feedback and the whole thing will be a little bit more efficient. I'll also point out that by the time you're done with bucket B and then bucket A, you'll realize you don't have the energy and you just don't want to work on bucket C options, which I think is a good thing. Now, with the 14th point, there's this data visualization formula that I put together, and it's what I use to judge visualizations on whether or not they'll be successful or effective. Jump to that presentation. So this is my personal formula. And the first thing that you get started off with here is looking at attention spans. We all have limited amounts of attention spans. You could say that to really understand things, people might have half an hour to understand presentations or documents. In our digital world, I think you'll more likely believe that it's probably a smaller amount. And when it comes to websites or first impressions, it's probably going to be around 3 seconds. And if you were to ask me, I actually think it's going to be a lot less. So you know that people have limited attention spans, but you need them to pay attention enough so that they can maybe understand what you're trying to tell them. And you have a few factors to help with it. First of all, being relevance. You could have the most boring data in the world and even the worst slides ever. But if it's something like if you're presenting to, say, your boss or your boss's boss, and it's data that's relevant to them, they'll care and they'll put in the effort to try and understand what you have to say. Another factor that helps with this is engagement or visual engagement. If you have something that's visually engaging, people will be willing to dive in to try and learn or understand, even if it takes more time to do so. So, for example, this is a visualization that comes from an insurance report, insurance company's annual report. And this visualization is around their social media shares and posts. And so this looks kind of complex. It's not super clear, but it is so visually engaging such that if you were to see this, maybe provide a little bit of information, you might be more willing to dive into this to understand what it's trying to say. On the flip side, instead of trying to increase the need for attention spans, you could make things a little bit more accessible by making them clearer. And so that would require less attention. So a clear chart or graph just needs less time, right, for people to understand what's going on there. And in this example, the red line shows the weekly ICU admissions of COVID-19 patients per million for England for the year 2020-2021. And you can compare them against the gray lines of flu seasons and ICU admissions at those different years before. This chart itself is not particularly visually appealing, but it's pretty clear, and so that helps you understand it fairly quickly. So you have this first hurdle, again, around attention spans, and you have factors like relevance, clarity, and engagement. And when you stack them together, you ask this question, does it pass? And ideally, it passes this bar for attention. And so for this particular chart, you can make the argument that it is not really engaging, but it's quite clear and relevant even if you're not from England. And so it passes. This particular chart or visualization, it's engaging, it's not very clear, it's not very relevant, but you're willing to spend the extra time to understand what's going on there, and so it still does pass. Now, with this particular 3D triangular chart, and actually it's two of them, if you notice here, these colors are to do with the car manufacturers, car makers, and so there's two charts, one around communication system score, which are what you see here, and then around the driver assistance systems and the values over here. So I'd make the argument here that if that's all you care about, trying to understand if you have this attention bar, I think it does actually pass it. It is visually engaging, right? You're kind of drawn into it more than a typical chart would. It's not very clear, and it's probably not very relevant to you. But even though it does pass this bar, it feels like it probably shouldn't be on the same level as something like this because they're quite different. And why is that? Because there is a second hurdle, and that hurdle is action. And so I take a look at this. Hey, I've spent time to understand this. Now I have some understanding and I get some entertainment and relevant insights. Now, it's not particularly entertaining. It's not particularly relevant either. And so I don't take any action. Let's say I don't share this or I don't forward this to other people. Whereas with this one, at least for me in the visualization space, it's entertaining and might actually be more insightful, relevant anyhow to what it is that I do. And so it passes that second bar for me to try and share this with other people. So the formula itself, we've gone through all the different elements, is that you have these factors of relevance, clarity, and engagement, and they added together need to pass this bar of attention. Once you've done that, then you can lead to some form of understanding, and with the outputs of relevant insights and entertainment, both of which have to add up together to pass another bar of action. When it comes to virality, you could ask the question, what's the most important element here in order to cause that to happen? And I'll use an example of something that I built some time ago. It's an animation of the suburbanification of Edmonton. So the building ages are visually shown over time, over 7 seconds. And you basically see that Edmonton as a city has grown from the inside, the core, out to the suburbs. Now, I make the argument that it isn't it's not particularly clear, but it is visually engaging. So you might be tempted to then look at multiple loops of it to understand what's going on. And for the people in Edmonton, it's fairly relevant. And in terms of the output, it's entertaining, it's relevant for them in terms of insights. So as a result, it did actually end up going viral. So visual engagement might be a requirement, like the one that we just showed just now. And I'd say the answer is probably not, because in this case, this is 123,000 upvotes here on a posting on Reddit. Now, for you, those of you who aren't familiar, most of Reddit's users don't upvote or they don't post or comment. So this might actually mean 1 million or more likely 10 million views at this point of this particular chart. And when you look at this, it's a comparison of names that are similar to the names that are of kids born with the name Karen over time. And it's just based off of the stereotype of parents that call the manager whenever any small minor thing happens. And so I guess the suggestion here is to see, what's the male equivalent of a Karen. I'll pause here to just say that it's just a stereotype. I know many Karens, a few of them who will likely see these videos, and I just feel bad for them that, it's just this weird stereotype that people have. When it comes to applying that particular chart to this formula, you'll say, well, it's not very visually engaging. It's fairly clear. It's maybe not super relevant either, but there's a good entertainment value here, and the insight's not so big either, but it's an interesting and entertaining thing, and that's why it went viral. Let's go with another particular chart here, and this is a pie chart, which tends to be more visually engaging because people like round areas that are shaded, and in this case, 111,000 upvotes probably again means tens of millions of users or viewers who have gone through and seen this. But yeah, it's essentially a metric around the percentage of Redditors who lurk and don't comment or post. And so for this one, I'd say maybe a little bit more engagement, quite clear. Definitely also somewhat relevant to, or probably more relevant to the audience for Redditors. And so the relevant insights actually are larger. Entertainment is somewhat there, but probably not as much as the previous one. So you might look at these previous charts and think, oh, maybe clarity is necessary. It's the most important thing. I'll just go back to the example that I used at the very beginning of this part of the presentation, which is that you could have relevant data that is not clear nor engaging, and still people will be willing to spend the time and effort to pay attention to it, to understand it, and then draw out the relevant insights or entertainment that's in the data itself. It's to say that each of these factors aren't mutually exclusive, and ideally you want all three of them together, but one of each might be necessary for you to push to get people to understand it initially. It depends a lot on the audience in this case. So yeah, it's not a single point is necessary for you to get understanding from people. A general note about targeting the public, I'll just use the example from New York Times. Over time, they've created fewer and fewer interactive visualizations because they've realized that people don't want to have to learn something new to try and interact with data. People like scrolling, and so more and more of their visualization efforts or data efforts have gone towards storytelling experiences, which are just people scrolling, and it's almost like storytelling. And yeah, that's just how I think the industry has started to move. That's not to say that interactive visualizations are a bad thing. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be built. It really does depend on your audience. Sometimes your audience might be just people who are scientists who need to interact with the data to create some sort of insight or to draw their own insights from. And so you do need interactive visualizations in that case. Finally, here is my visualization formula and the elements I use to design visualizations and predict whether mine or other visualizations will be successful. We'll go back to the other presentation, the main one, and the final point here is a bit of a weird one. It depends. It's just to say that any piece of advice that you get around presentations, even the ones that I've given you, the 15 insights or the 14 insights I've talked about so far, you could probably find a counterexample that's effective as well. So as an example, I mentioned earlier that bullet hell is a bad thing. You don't want to have it, and you probably shouldn't have all the different bullet points on the slide. But now I'm going to show you this one. In this case, I think it's actually perfect, right? You might actually want to have a lot of bullets for a reference. And so I'm actually going to give you about 10 seconds here to read through this yourself, to just recollect the different points that we've gone through so far. Right, and that's the end of the session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at eugene@ideaowl.com. Special thanks to Yukon Economic Development again. I also wanted to shout out to Canadian Open Data Society, and in particular, our executive director, Paul Connor, for organizing the data-driven entrepreneurship and innovation sessions. And thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned a few things, and hopefully it will be able to help you get better at pitching to the point that you would enjoy it if you don't already. I will see you in another video, and goodbye.